One more time, one more time.
It's probably you, me, and Anya.
You like basketball?
She's going to Oregon State.
You know what?
She's going to Oregon State. And they're playing Oregon State.
Cheering interest. Okay, that'll work. Without a doubt. Let me know where you want me to meet you off.
Okay.
We go from there. No, you mean. See, I need to set healthy boundaries on my monotony, so that'll help me. Hopefully, get a little bit of control of the work, gym, sleep routine. All right, yeah, I'm probably gonna. I can almost guarantee this is gonna be a mess, but here we go.
Well, John's been reading the whole time. I bet he could give a lesson.
See, that's sad because he probably has been reading the right stuff. I'm still going backwards though. This is so it's so disappointing. I probably should have sent out a message and been like, you know what? I'm not moving. But I'm gonna try to hurry through some things and finish up what we talked about on Sunday from 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, because I got preoccupied trying to narrow down what we talked about from the Word to kind of a practical study, since I know you all have been missing PowerPoint. Yeah, okay, anyway, maybe not. Anyway, summing up what we talked about on Sunday. Can't take a whole lot of time because there is a lot of video. We're not going to make it through all of it anyway, but do the best I can. First Thessalonians and 2nd Thessalonians. We're basically talking about being encouraged in the last days. Because, of course, Church of Thessalonica seemed to have one of those recurring themes. Here we go. Anyway, that is what it is. Is that you? No?
Oh, yeah, that's me.
Okay, I was about to say.
No wonder I can't see what I'm looking for.
No worries. Being encouraged in the last times, because the Church of Thessalonica, we said, it had some parallel themes between first letter and the second letter. Paul broaching some themes, trying to finish them up in the second letter. This was one of those, which was the end times thing. And one of the things that, of course, we have in common with them is we can, as we talked about on Sunday, range the spectrum. We can go so far into prophecy that we get obsessed about trying to pick a date and a time and following down that path, which is pretty much what I spent the last 2 days doing. But we can also go to the other extreme of not paying attention to it at all. So what we said was we're going to try to find some balance, understanding that the encouragement he gave them was from actual preparedness. Meaning, the reason why they didn't have to worry is because he wanted them to be so dedicated to being ready to see God that it didn't matter if he came back today, tomorrow, or in 20 years. It was irrelevant because they were ready either way. And so that's what he wanted them to do. And part of that was making sure that they understood the signs of the times. And so we talked about being encouraged and being ready were the themes, but within those themes, he gave some details. And some of the things that I wasn't able to do was tie together themes because I ran long on other issues. But we have 3 people that he says are going to factor in prominently if you are paying attention to end times things. He names the man of lawlessness, right? But the man of lawlessness is not all that different from somebody we talked about in Revelation 13, and that is the beast. And neither of them are all that different from the Antichrist. And I say not all that different, meaning it's not necessarily all that easy to say that they are or are not the same thing or person, even if you believe the beast is a person. Some theories believe that it is more of a power structure as opposed to an individual. But the bottom line is within those 3 beings that prominently show up in the end times, they are all working under, at least 2 of them are specifically identified as working under the power of Satan. And so in 2 Thessalonians, he says that by the power of, the man of lawlessness comes by the power of Satan, giving us false signs and wonders, working wicked deception for those who like to be deceived, he's going to say. And ultimately, the whole point of what he's saying practically, if we go back to, okay, Marcus, what's the practical application? Is he says, even if you don't necessarily understand prophecy, if beyond all the things he said with regard to loving one another, if you add one more love to your daily life, you won't have to worry about what's going on with either the man of lawlessness, the beast, or the Antichrist. If you find a way to love truth, he's like, that's the hack. That is the thing that will keep you safe in any time, whether or not it is the age leading up to 70 AD in the fall of Jerusalem, or if it's the ultimate end time when Christ is returning. The way in which they are setting traps, it's like if we're going fishing, we're casting a line out in the water. You want to know what's the bait, right? You don't want to fish for largemouth bass with catfish bait, right? Steak baits. That's a southern thing. You got to find the right bait for the right fish. And that's what he's saying. The bait in the end times is deception. And if you love truth, you're going to have a natural gag response to the things that the enemy is trying to do. And so Paul is trying to get you to up your gag response to things that the enemy would try to feed you. And he says that's the hack that will keep you safe in end times, if you just want a practical application. And so that will keep you away from the schemes of both either the man of lawlessness, who Paul identifies, or John, as he identifies through Christ, the beast, and then in his epistle, the Antichrist. One of the things, as we go into that whole theme of deception, try to find another unique color, is like we said, delusion and wicked deception are the tools there for the man of lawlessness, as they also are for the Antichrist. What's the deception with the Antichrist? He is one, or as John says, many Antichrists have gone out. They go out in the spirit of denying both Christ and the Father. And so once again, that is a whole bait, or it's a scheme, the deception. And once again, if we're looking at the dragon gives his power to the beast. And we talked about not only his power, but his power, throne, and authority to the beast. And the beast is assisted by a false prophet. And so that theme of deception goes through each one of these pieces of the revelation of what the end times will be like and what the enemy will actually be up to in all of those. What I would like to focus on tonight, however, is this middle section, which gives us an indication of what begins to unfold. Sorry. Should have drawn that down there. In Revelation 6, as you get to the unveiling of the seals. And in helping us move forward, what I started to realize is one of the reasons why I fell down the rabbit hole this time was because I flagged so many different stories out of the news that I'd begun to forget that one of the ways that deception works is simply by catching my attention on the next new thing. It's kind of like we talked about with cars before, right? I get a car, I like it, but they come out with the new model year and I'm like, oh, that's nice, right? With the news, it's the same thing. I've forgotten how many things that a year ago that seemed to be earth-shattering that had faded completely in the distant memory because the next new thing came along. And I thought that that's one of the things. One of the tools of deception isn't deception at all. It's simply getting me to bite on the next new thing. And for that reason, I am kind of going back through my archive of the last year and trying to coordinate it with some of the seals and the trumpets and maybe one or two of the bowls that we see out of the 3 series of 7 that Jesus works in the Revelation. But before that, who likes magic? Who likes magic? I know it's a trick question because the preacher always talks about now no witchcraft, right? Okay, it's okay to like magic as long as it's not like evil. But okay, that's a trick question.
We thought it was sports related. We were talking about magic.
All right. I don't think I have a sports analogy. I'll think of one. But anyway, that was a fair guess though, without a doubt. But the magic that we're going to talk about is going to come along the lines of these things out of 2 Thessalonians 6. Skipping down to verse 9, of course, starting at verse 7, I guess. For the mystery of lawlessness is already at work. Only he who now restrains it will do so until he's out of the way. And the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord Jesus will kill with the breath of his mouth and bring to nothing by the appearance of his coming. The coming of the lawless one is by the activity of Satan with all power and false signs and wonders and with all wicked deception for those who are perishing because they refuse to love the truth and so be saved. And so we're going to focus on that verse 9. By the activity of Satan with all power, false signs, and wonders, and with that magic. And this is a disclaimer. I tried to edit all the video for language, so please forgive me if I miss something. All right, but here we go. All right, who knows who that is? The magician, I mean. Not the comedian. His name is David Blaine. He was famous a while ago for 3 series, at least 3 series. One was called Street Magic, where he tried to break down the wall of illusion, understanding that there's kind of like the Houdini, there's the mysticism, the secrets of magic. He tried to remove that and start doing tricks so close that people could not possibly tell where the illusion lay. And so ultimately, the frog reference he made in the video, what'd you make of the frog reference? Now that I've advanced it too far to the next screen. Just a throwaway line? Do you think that was an illusion, or was that possibly... Oh, no.
Well, Pharaoh,
Yeah.
you know, his magicians could emulate some of what Moses and Aaron were doing.
Yeah.
The rod into a snake and water into blood. And the frogs, were they further down the line, or did they emulate that one too? In other words, they could.
Emulate quite a few of them.
Yeah, but they got to a point they couldn't match.
That's right. That goes
miracles, but they were
adept at. Yeah.
So I thought maybe that's where the frog came from. Because frogs was one of the things.
Well, I picked that clip because he's done that trick before. But I picked that clip because he specifically made the biblical reference in that one. And I thought that was interesting. So do you think it was more or less a throwaway line, or do you think it might be more or less, potentially, the reason I brought it up is because, you never know. There was an illusionist years ago, no video of it, but of course, most of us understand that, if you can avoid it, don't reinvent the wheel. So sometimes you simply draw on the history of what you have that's come before you. And so he's not the first person to vomit up goldfish and frogs and things like that. It could completely be an illusion. But ultimately, the revelation points to a time when there actually will be false signs and miracles. And we talked about these things being similar to the relationship between tremors and an earthquake. And when you talk about the relationship between tremors and an earthquake, what are we saying there? The relationship between tremors and an earthquake is what?
The tremors are a sign, and the earthquake's the actual damage.
That's it. The earthquake is the thing. The tremors are the thing before the thing. And so ultimately, even if this guy really is completely... Even if he is the best illusionist to ever live. Ultimately, there is a time when it's not really going to be illusions anymore. There's coming a time when it's actually going to be more like what you saw in the days of Pharaoh. False miracles, false signs, and false wonders. Want to see another one? Oh, either way, of course, I'm going to advance the slides.
Is everything all right? What's going on? Show everybody. Just do it. Boom. Aim it at the cars. See it. Oh no. Oh god. On you go. No. Absolutely. Exactly what's going on. Oh, look at that. Understood. You could somehow provoke Kelly to go. Shove it in there? Still holding the candle. Okay. She's so nervous. Wait. Oh god. Cut him. Cut him out. It doesn't have to be that close.
Like a lit.
Oh god.
There we go.
Oh god.
For me to take? Happy birthday, friend. No.
A little more impressive, baby? They're like, nah, that's too simple. All right, one more, and this has almost no audio because it's Ricky Gervais, so. Take your mind back to the days of Charlie Chaplin.
Looks pretty real, right?
I'm sorry, I don't understand. How is that not real? What do you mean it looks pretty real?
It's the same as what I just did to you.
If that is a trick, how is that a trick?
You know what, Ricky, here, do me a favor. Grab the needle right here
Yeah?
and pull it out so you can see the magic trick. Get it? Grab it. There, good. Grab
What do you mean?
And grab
Put it out
Pull
where
it.
it's come.
Yeah, pull it out. Get it? Just pull it right out.
Right, okay.
Pull it out.
Is that needle going through your arm?
Oh, pull it out. You'll see how it works. Pull it.
This is real. Sorry, this is real. That's real. That's not a trick.
What happened to the wound? Yeah, exactly. Anyway, at some point the Bible says it's no longer magic tricks, whatever David Blaine actually is. All right, so moving on to the seals. Chapter 6 of the Revelation. I watched as the Lamb opened one of the 7 seals, and I heard that one of the 4 living creatures say, with a voice like thunder, "Come." And I looked, and behold, the white horse and its rider had a bow, and a crown was given to him. And a bow was given him, and he came out conquering and to conquer. And we talked about that before, but what we what I've begun to forget in this most recent cycle of the news is comprehensively, front to back, with COVID. The one theme that's going to kind of run through all of these videos is all of these things are basically repeats of things we've seen in history before. Is COVID the first plague we've seen in history? No. What's that? What's that?
It's not even a particularly bad one.
Exactly, exactly. Well, we've had Spanish flu before, right?
Yeah, 1918.
Right? Other huge flus, right? Right? How many of them shut down the global economy?
Well, Black Plague did a pretty good
Pretty good job.
job of it, but he only killed half the people, so.
Killed half the people. How many of those were able, or was, I guess, one country able to shut down the economies on every continent just by decree? And that's the thing that we may want to look at going forward. The things that we're seeing now are trends that affect the entire globe in ways we might not have seen before. Much like the way in the first century, the difference between what was able to take the gospel forward had a lot to do with the fact that Rome had basically conquered the globe in ways that it hadn't before. And so Jesus came empowering the apostles in a time when they were able to travel through the ends of the earth in ways they hadn't before. So when you get to the beginning of Acts, and he says, you will be my witnesses in Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. That coincided with a period of history where it was more easy to access the world from a practical perspective than it had been before. And so now we're in a technological age where things that are happening on one part of the globe, even if it's something like a pandemic, are affecting the world in ways I'm not sure it has before. And that's what these pundits, for lack of a better term, are going to talk about.
The United States especially has been now accustomed for 25 years as being the universal and unitary superpower. That's not going to last forever. I think most people know this, even though some may be in cognitive dissonance over this. The truth is there are rising powers like Russia and China, but there are other rising powers too. One of our problems is that we live in a state-centric view of the universe. International relations, for most of us, is run by states. Nation-states are the global political unit of the international order. And this is what we learned in social studies as kids. But that is actually not the way the world has worked for most of human history. States are actually about 300 or 400 years old. Before there were states, there were empires and there were tribes and everything else. The reign of states, and only states can wage war legitimately, that is coming to a close. We're actually going back to the status quo ante of when global order was a free-for-all, of like the Middle Ages, of antiquity, what became before. And one of the things of that free-for-all is that who else are superpowers? It wasn't just states. So like in the Middle Ages, the papacy was a superpower. Rich aristocracies were superpowers. And we're going back to this world again. So we have random billionaires today who have as much power as states. There are 62 people in the planet who own the equivalent of half the world's wealth. 62 people. You can put them all into a bus. You have multinational corporations. We have the Fortune 500, which are more powerful than most of the states in the world. Of the 194 states in the world, most are fragile or failed. We only think the top 25 states, like the US, Western Europe, Eastern Asia, etc. But that's an anomaly. The vast majority of states in the world are more either regimes hiding inside states or just outright dumpster fires. So what we're going to see in the future is those who have wealth and political power, who can also hire their own private armies now, become superpowers.
There's even a lot of regular people out there, not billionaires, have an intuition that someone like Bill Gates is just so smart, is certainly smarter than your congresswoman, perhaps, or congressman, and you're not thrilled about their performance in office, so you think someone who made a lot of money, in the stock market or in tech, they can give away this money that's more efficient and solve the problem. Here's the problem with it. And it's a good time to think about it with Christmas, where there's so many pleas for charity all around. And I have no problem with regular people giving money. That's good. I'm talking about billionaires trying to solve problems with money. The problem is, when they do that, they are actually governing us, right? It's not like dropping a few bills into the Salvation Army bucket. It is not like when you give money. When you give money away, you're just helping someone. Bill Gates, it's like a monster, right? Like, they're so big that simply by stepping into the realm of government, because of their sheer size, they are ruling, they are governing. He can't help education without shifting in an undemocratic manner how education works. What education is defined as good, what education is defined as bad. He can't get into public health without redefining, and that is undemocratic. Even if the best billionaire, who has never evaded taxes, who has never avoided taxes, who does not lobby, and by the way, this would eliminate virtually all of them, my caveat. But even if someone were to exist along these lines, having that much private power over public life is why the United States declared independence from Britain a long time ago. And it's not time to go back to a time of monarchs.
Ultimately, take it or leave it. We talked about the number of the beast in Revelation 13, famous number. What was the whole issue with the number of the beast? How did anybody have the power to say you get it or you don't?
It'd have been up to whoever controlled the marketplace.
Yeah. So what was the leverage, or what was the penalty for not getting the number?
You don't participate in the market.
You don't, I mean, in what way?
You can't buy and sell food.
You can't buy and sell. So how do you get to the point where somebody can tell you you can't buy or sell? Now I go to the grocery store, I got $5, I go get whatever I want. How do you get to the point where you're able to control whether people can go to the grocery store and buy or sell food? Globally.
By cutting off the food supply.
Well,
If
it's not saying the food's not there. It's not saying the food's not there. It's saying you can't buy what's available. That can be a question for thought for later. But ultimately, what these secular pundits are saying is completely consistent with the whole concept of moving from a society where decision making is diffuse and it's independent to a situation where one person is able to control exactly what you have permission to do and not to do as an individual. And so that's exactly what the end times prophecies are talking about. When it's talking about that whole concept of a person of lawlessness, it's talking about a beast who has the power to demand that people get a mark if they're going to participate in commerce, or an antichrist. It is talking about, just as the first gentleman was saying, we're looking at a situation where our sense of normalcy now, where we function under a state that is the sovereign, that helps us decide, okay, these are what the laws are and this is how we go about changing them. These individuals from outside of biblical thinking are saying that's going away. And so, like I said before, one of my approaches is, it's called stipulated facts. If you have something in the secular world that is completely consistent with what the Bible is telling you, that pretty much gives you an opportunity to move forward and say, okay, that's something we don't even have to argue about. But ultimately, what Paul is talking about in his last times prophecies is this entire field of end times prophecies. It's just like Jesus said when he was talking to the religious establishment as he was going to the cross. We talked about it in each of the Gospels. he would go into Jerusalem. He would have his authority questioned, and he would give some prophecies about what was going to happen in the end times. And he said, this is the irony. You're able to read the signs of the time. So you can look at the sky and tell what the weather is going to be like. You can look at a fig tree and tell what's going to happen with the seasons that are coming. But he said, you can't even look at the times as they're lining up as God's people and say that these are the seasons that are approaching, even if it's not an earthquake, but simply a tremor. And so that's what these individuals are saying. Even though they don't necessarily believe in a God, they're saying some of the same things that line up with 2,000 and 3,000-year-old prophecies. And so with that, moving forward. Second seal.
Even a lot of regular.
Sorry. Talked about another horse, a bright red horse that was permitted to take peace from the earth. And with that, DW, German News Network, halfway through the pandemic, noticed that this is what was taking place around different parts of the globe.
Both Ecuador and Chile have seen intense anti-government protests. The demonstrations began after the presidents in each country made economic announcements, which in turn sparked a massive public outcry. But there are protests with similar motives happening all over the world as well. Lebanon, Iran, Iraq, Colombia. Many of the crises stand out for being the most severe periods of turmoil in at least a decade. So, what do all these protests have in common? Experts say the answer may be inequality. People around the world are rising up against the growing gap between the rich or political elite and the poor. After all, many of those protesting are people who have long felt shut out of the wealth of their countries. In at least 4 cases, a rise in price for a key service had proven the final straw. In Ecuador, that final straw was rising petrol prices. In Iran, gas prices were also the tipping point that got people outside and on the streets. In Lebanon, it was attacks on internet calls, like those made via WhatsApp. In Chile, a 3.75% fare hike was announced for the public transit system. Here's what Chile's metro stations looked like following that announcement. A slowing global economy and a youth bulge in many countries has produced a new generation that's frustrated. According to the International Labor Organization, 44% of young people of working age are either unemployed or working jobs that don't pay enough to escape poverty. And an increase in youth unemployment is one of the best predictors of social unrest.
مشروعة ووطنية بدون أي مسميات طائفية أو حزبية أو مناطقية. مطالبنا واضحة اللي مثل ما تشوف قدامك. احنا ليش الصناعة العراقية متوقفة؟ شنو السبب؟ وليش البطالة منتشرة بالعراق؟ بلد غني، بلد نفطي، بلد صناعي، بلد زراعي، بلد تجارة. ليش الشباب قاعدة على طاولة بطالة؟
No hay que bajar los brazos y hay que seguir viniendo, hay que seguir manifestándose porque no hemos conseguido absolutamente nada y además sigue la represión.
نحن ليه بنختلف عن غير أجيال؟ لأن غير أجيال ضلوا بهالنظام 30 سنة وضلوا ما انطبقوا، بس طفح الكيل. يعني لما نجي نصرخ نحن قاطعين بالكافيات عم نقول يا شعب اللي بالكافيات طلعوا خلص بكفي، لأنه عن جد بكفي. 30 سنة نحن ما فينا بقى نتحمل، نحن جينا اللي بده ياكلها بالنهاية.
Citizens worldwide continue to feel disillusioned with unresponsive governments, while activists are sure that street action is the only way to force change.
In another respect, more locally,
A With many states under stay-at-home orders, domestic abuse calls are on the rise across the country and here in West Michigan.
Many victims may feel trapped at home or unable to get away from a dangerous situation. Our Annie Sutowski joins us live now with a look at the spike local organizations are seeing and where victims can go for help. Annie.
Yeah, Doug, Janice, being cooped up right now is hard for all of us, but imagine having to do that with the person who is either physically or emotionally abusing you. Now, even though courthouses like the one here in Kent County are operating on a limited basis, they say that they can't help in emergency situations, and that includes helping you file a personal protection order.
Everyone's in closed quarters. We're not used to being, captive in our homes. And so people's tension can rise pretty easily.
Erica Lufin-Salerno, a family law attorney and partner with Varnum Law, says she's not surprised at the increase in domestic violence and child abuse cases she's seeing. In fact, in Ottawa County, Resilience Advocates for Ending Violence says they've seen a 66% increase in requests for emergency shelter.
I noticed this week we had a survivor call us from inside a closet while she was trying to hide the phone call.
Megan Hennessy, the program director for the organization, says there are a few reasons for the spike.
When home isn't safe and you're not allowed to leave home, usually other people, their safe places are church or work or school or clubs, other places in the community that they can go out and reach and get help from. That's something that might be cut off right now.
Hennessy says tensions are high, from feeling a loss of control to finances.
If they're feeling that stress, a lot of the times the way that they deal with that stress is by escalating their abusive behaviors. And so we might see more people getting hurt or even at risk for homicide during this time.
And then finally in that regard.
Tonight, the FBI is stepping up its efforts to counter the shocking surge in attacks on Asian Americans. They've skyrocketed in the past year as some falsely blame Asians for the pandemic. We get more on this from CBS's Jeff Begays.
In New York City, police are investigating a hammer attack on an Asian woman that was caught on surveillance video. In Baltimore, a man wielding a cement block attacked two Korean women simply trying to close down their store. The number of brazen attacks on Asians is rising across the country. According to the group Stop Asian American Pacific Islander Hate, there have been more than 6,600 incidents from March 2020 to March 2021. Women have been the target nearly 65% of the time.
What's happening to our communities is truly devastating. We know that 1/3 of community members really fear being attacked.
In San Francisco, a suspect has been arrested in connection with an attack against two Asian women, including on an 84-year-old. The Alameda County, California District Attorney formed a special response unit to handle the growing number of cases.
We have 78 victims that we're working with just since we put together the unit at the end of January. This has skyrocketed.
Today, the FBI announced that it is increasing the Bureau's anti-hate crime efforts.
I think in some communities there's this reflexive resistance and even a distrust of law enforcement, and that is a barrier that we are trying to break down.
The FBI says that it is surging resources to combat hate crimes, and that is happening as the Justice Department continues its review of how hate crimes are being tracked. They are often underreported by law enforcement. Nora.
Jeff Begays.
And of course, all that goes back to, at least the some of the experts who were interviewed said, it goes back to economic stress in many ways. And so the reason why, what Paul talked about before, is not necessarily to cause alarm, is because these things ebb and flow. But we talked about, just like a stock graph may go up for a period of time before it goes down, it generally trends in one direction, either up or down. And so ultimately, just as the news cycle can change and my attention can go to other things, it can be easy for me to lose track of where the new floor is. And so we used to say it this way: what's one of the reasons why it was so important to, in the Michael Jackson case, one of the things that was really telling about what he was doing with the young people he was taking in was he would put pornographic material out on the table in front of kids who were underage. What was wrong with that? What was wrong with that? Of course, but specifically, what was so sinister about it? Other than the fact that kids aren't supposed to be exposed to that, there is a motive behind it. Why was that an indicator of a larger issue? He's desensitizing them. He's taking kids who should have a gag response to that material at that age, and he's making them think that it's okay, it's coffee table material. Just like you might have out a National Geographic or your daily news. He's normalizing something that is completely toxic for a purpose of basically introducing the kids to unhealthy behaviors. And so that's what's going on with what we're talking about. The danger in the shifting news cycle isn't simply me forgetting, it's me forgetting where the bar used to be. So one of the things we've talked about is on the downside of things, it's bad to, as the Bible says, wish too much for the good old days. But there is a logic in that. We wish for the good old days because we realize when we take a look back just how far we've fallen. We talked about before, one of the prophets says, consider your ways. Consider from where you have fallen. That is one of the ways that God called his people back to understanding how they, by degrees, had been dragged into a place that looked very different from where he had called them when they left Egypt. When they left Egypt, there was a nation or two nations called Sodom and Gomorrah. I mean, even before that he had destroyed, and they were the epitome of wickedness. By the time we get to the end of Judges, why is God stepping in, or why is the nation going into civil war? We've talked about this before. Why does the nation go into civil war at the end of Judges?
The concubines cut in 12 pieces.
Thank you. Cut the concubine into 12 pieces to send a message to the 12 tribes. What had been done to the concubine?
Raped all night, killed.
In much the same way that the men of Sodom and Gomorrah wanted to get to the angels when they came to visit Abraham. And so what happened was Israel, by degrees, had been taken into the very place of the epitome of wickedness, Sodom and Gomorrah. So God's people had actually become the very thing that God hated. And it was by degrees they were taken that way. And so that's the danger of slipping into this cycle of simply following the news cycle as it descends. We lose track of whether or not the trend is moving up or moving down. And ultimately, we're going to see a couple of other experts talk about how the economy is going to play an even potentially more ominous role in days ahead.
On Wall Street, a head-snapping reaction to Ukraine. The stock market staging a huge recovery from an 859-point sell-off at the open after President Biden did not announce the toughest possible sanctions against Russia. But with the markets sliding in recent weeks, Americans' investments and retirement accounts are already feeling the squeeze. And even more pain at the pump. Russia is the second largest exporter of oil and gas. Today, oil pushed $100 a barrel on the global markets. For every $10 increase, gas prices also rise by 20 cents. Now with regular averaging $3.54 nationwide, $4.77 in California, experts predict prices could jump quickly.
Americans will be paying at least 15 to 20 cents a gallon more here because of the inversion, and that's just over the next 2 weeks with the potential for much more than that.
In Chicago, bracing for prices to go even higher.
It's out of control. It's hard to believe it's over $5 a gallon right now for me to fill my tank.
Food prices already soaring could get even more expensive. Ukraine is a big wheat exporter. A war a world away, coming home to America's dinner plates and gas tanks. Tom Costello, NBC News, Washington.
Of course, that last...
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.
The rider on the black horse, of course, indicating what we talked about on Sunday, an increase in inflation. Is what Charlie Munger has to say about the current situation. I think this might be before the actual invasion started.
I mentioned inflation, Charlie, and the stock market is down a bit this year, maybe because of inflation, also the tensions in Russia and Ukraine. Maybe we'll get to that in a second. But I want to ask you specifically about inflation. Are we looking at a prolonged decline in the markets because of inflation? Is inflation on the rise, and should we be concerned about it?
Well, let me take that in the reverse order. Inflation is a very serious subject. You can argue it's the way democracies die. When democracy dies in Latin America, inflation is a big part of it. So it's a huge danger once you've got a populace that learns it can vote itself money. If you overdo it too much, you ruin your civilization a lot. And so, of course, it's a big long-range danger. If you look at the Roman Republic, and even after they went to an empire with an absolute ruler, they inflated the currency steadily for hundreds of years, and eventually the whole damn Roman Empire collapsed. So it's the biggest long-range danger we have, probably, apart from nuclear war.
Is it something investors need to be worried about, specifically when it comes to growth stocks right now?
Well, I think the safe assumption for an investor is that over the next 100 years, the currency is going to zero. That's my working hypothesis.
Wow. Well, that'll be a different type of environment, won't it?
A very dangerous environment.
And what about the Federal Reserve?
What brought in Hitler was the combination of the Weimar inflation, where they utterly destroyed the savings of the middle class in Germany, followed by the Great Depression. It was a 1-2 punch. And Hitler came in, crazy demagogue, with 40% of the votes, and pretty soon we had a dictator hell-bent for world war. So the history is not pleasant. And Germany was a very advanced and civilized nation, the Germany that Hitler took over. I always say that the interesting thing about that was little Albert Einstein, the little Jewish boy, got his entire primary education with the insistence of the Catholic Church in Germany. Now that is a very civilized nation. So if you let your nation deteriorate too much, what you get is a Hitler. We proved it.
Going back to inflation specifically though, Charlie, do you think the Federal Reserve is doing the right thing now or not?
Well, of course, in a modern democracy in the age of Keynes, you're going to get big government reaction. The reaction this time was bigger than it's ever been before in the history of the United States. They just threw money at the problem. And they were probably right to fear what was going to happen and to be quite liberal in throwing money at it, but they probably overdid it a little. They threw so much money so fast that it's hard for the restaurants to get people to do the work. But I don't criticize it. It's hard to make these decisions under pressure.
How concerned are you about Russia and Ukraine right now?
Well, of course, nobody likes it. No, I don't. Of course, I don't like it.
This was pre-invasion.
But is it a big
Anybody
concern?
like the trouble with? I don't think Russia likes it. I don't think it's good for anybody.
All right, and then finally, what we talked about before, right on the pale horse, it has a lot to do with why I decided not to skip this particular passage at all, but tying what Charlie Munger said in with those other experts, that basically points in the same direction. You've got him saying that economic indicators point toward periods in history where the economic situation makes people cry out for exactly what the Bible says is eventually on the horizon. I did not pull a quote from Michael Berry, because Michael Berry, once again, the individual who predicted the 2008 housing market crash, is also predicting along the same lines of what Charlie Munger said, increased inflation as opposed to temporary inflation. And so that all fits in. You have those secular minds, and Charlie Munger is actually a believer, but he reasons and he's revered by people in the secular marketplace, lining up with the men who are theorizing, okay, geopolitically, what are things pointing towards? Okay, the concentration of wealth is pointing in the exact same direction that the Financial Times are pointing, where very few people, like we said on Sunday, when Ukraine needed to get the internet cut back on, did they call a national power or nation state? Who did they call? Huh?
Musk.
Yeah, they call Elon Musk. That's an individual. And so that's a practical application of what these pundits were saying before the war started, is look, you're having a situation where governments are less powerful than individuals. And so you have these individuals, many of whom were saying these things before the war became an issue, the war now making it obvious that what they were saying from the political standpoint lines up with what Charlie Munger was saying from the financial standpoint, with what Michael Berry is saying from the financial standpoint, with what dead prophets were saying back in biblical times. And it lines up with each one of these points at the word's talking about. So we'll have to skip through, of course, for time, some of these which aren't quite as heavy, but when it talks about sword, famine, pestilence, and wild animal, I thought it was pretty funny because one of the things that they have compilations of, and this is more lighthearted, was the way that when people retreated into homes, how things like all kinds of wildlife that people weren't used to seeing in cities began to encroach. And once again, is that an earthquake? No. But what happens is, as the natural habitat for prey animals, and that's kind of an interesting combination area, a wild boar is both a prey animal and a relatively aggressive animal to try to run across. And so what some of the experts are saying is, of course, as people begin to go back out into their regular places, they're just going to go back into their natural habitat. But now what you're having is an overlap between the natural habitat that we were used to and the natural habitat that they were used to. And those prey animals are bringing predators closer into urban areas. And so ultimately, those are also the kinds of things that they're saying that are relative points of consideration. Since it's a little bit lighter, it might be worth watching. And some are cute, some are not quite as much. This is from India.
In India, seeing a leopard on CCTV has become common. Here, one stalks a supermarket car park. This one is in the courtyard of a building. Or here, where one walks between parked cars. Leopards are being seen more and more in Mumbai, India's financial capital, as they move closer to urban areas in search of food. Normally, leopards don't prey on humans, but in the last 2 years, attacks have tripled to around 6 a year. A leopard killed this girl while she was playing outside her home.
I still can't look at this photo without crying, so I keep it hidden. When I see it, it makes me think of my daughter.
She was only 3.5 years old.
The neighbours heard a noise. We thought that something had fallen, but it was my daughter running out of here. We wanted to save her, but we couldn't.
Leopards mostly eat stray dogs and sometimes pets. This dog was attacked by a leopard in the foyer of a building. There's not much the authorities can do. These patrolling officers work with the forest department.
We're heading to the north of the city because a few days ago a leopard was spotted there. People are scared because they've seen it a lot.
Their job is to find wild animals that have made their way into the town. Monkeys, snakes, and of course leopards.
We just saw a leopard right here. We turned the lights on and it ran away.
This terrified family has also seen the leopard, and it's not the first time.
There, can you see where I'm pointing? I've already seen leopards 2 or 3 times at night.
Mumbai used to be an enormous jungle. Now it has become one of the biggest cities on Earth, with a population of 20 million. Leopards' habitats have shrunk because of urban expansion, making it unsurprising that they come into contact with humans. A territorial war that's directly linked to India's overpopulation. Every year, the number of inhabitants in Mumbai grows by 500,000. Leopards and other wildlife try to survive in a 100 square kilometre habitat, but that space is rapidly
shrinking. Anyway, appreciate y'all's patience. Time's pretty much run. Next video is we to this day still have a wild boar problem in Texas. It's kind of unprecedented, so that's what some of those videos were.
It's probably still dark, and that's when hogs routinely move, is in the dark hours. And it looks like she had gotten out of her car and locked it, because the car was locked. And then was probably trying to make her way to the front door when it appears that these animals must have come along. It's unbelievably tragic. This is a very rare incident. Just one little research we have found, there's less than 6 of these have been reported in the nation over the many, many years of reporting these kind of deaths. There is no doubt in my mind or my criminal investigation captain, John Miller, that it was multiple animals. And we can kind of tell that from the different sizes of the bites. But in my 35 years, I will tell you, it's one of the worst things.
This is one of the worst things I've ever seen. Anyway, I'm gonna have to keep motoring through the videos and eventually wrap this up. But Seventh Trumpet, we at least got that far, which is at least some progress. Talks about 1/3 of the earth was burned up and 1/3 of the trees. Who remembers fire season this past year? Fire season, what was the biggest fire worldwide? Biggest fire worldwide? Fire season.
Water.
What's that?
Black water to fight it, really.
No. What was the biggest land in terms of land area?
Oh. Wasn't that California?
Amazon rainforest.
Australia.
Here's one in Oregon, but I don't think that was Australia or anything.
That was before, I think, though. This one in California was this year.
If you had to guess how many square miles, or how many acres, I'm sorry, the largest one burned, what would you guess? Just throw some guesses out there and then we'll wrap up. Okay. One more video.
A part of the world that usually epitomizes cold is now unseasonably very, very hot. Regions of northern Siberia are routinely 10 degrees higher than usual, often cracking 30 degrees. Yakutia is a cold, wintry place, she says. I didn't think it would ever get so hot here. The implications of the heat wave for Russia's landscape are already severe. 1.7 million hectares of forest and tundra are now on fire, including some areas that are less than 15 kilometers from the Arctic Ocean.
This fire season seems to be quite extreme.
Anton Benislavsky is Greenpeace Russia's wildfire coordinator.
So a lot of forests will be heavily damaged and destroyed.
Canada's Arctic is of course heating up too as climate change alters the Gulf Stream current, propelling warmer air north.
It's remarkable, scary.
Tundra ecologist Greg Henry is usually up in Ellesmere Island about now, monitoring climate change. But the pandemic has kept him back at UBC in Vancouver this season.
The Arctic has accumulated an awful lot of carbon. In fact, the sort of best estimates we have now is about twice as much carbon in the soils of the Arctic than is in the atmosphere right now. We would be speeding it up if the fires got in there and started burning that carbon. That's been locked away for thousands of years.
It's not just Russia's forests and air quality that suffered. This river turned crimson last month after 20,000 tons of diesel fuel leaked from a mining company reservoir. It appears thawing permafrost that held the containment area together melted. Greenpeace says government oversight is badly lacking, as are measures to mitigate climate change.
With a total lack of will to solve the problem, brings us to the fire catastrophe every year.
Though there was cooler weather this week, forecast models show fires continuing to spread, and this week's blip doesn't alter the projection for more extreme Arctic weather events as the region heats up twice as fast as the rest of the world. Chris Brown, CBC News.
Sorry, they're cutting off pretty quick. But the fires in Siberia were bigger than every fire on Earth combined, because Siberia is such a remote place. The Russian government could not get access to the forest to fight them, so they let them burn themselves out. And so taking that approach, they ended up being larger than the fires in Australia, the fires in California, fires in Colorado in our region. Those are the biggest fires on Earth. And so you can double the fires we had here, combine them with all the fires nationwide, and Siberia was larger than those. Why is that? Because annually, the fire seasons are simply are getting worse, and I was trying to think of which direction to go. But did you also notice the Red River? Yeah. What was that about that? Because some weird things that seem to be talked about in prophecy, maybe it's not talking about literal blood, maybe it is, but rivers turning that bright a crimson red aren't really normal. And so when you see those kinds of things in the news, then it makes some of these prophecies seem a lot less strange and more accessible, in terms of maybe it's talking about the waters literally turn to blood, but maybe it's talking about a time where things that we're seeing as phenomena really aren't as odd as they seem. And so once again, this is about tremors, it's not about earthquakes, but more importantly, the reason why I wanted to go ahead and go through this, other than the fact that it just ended up eating a bunch of my time, is it's kind of like when we talk about the area of cognitive behavioral therapy, that concept of journaling. And it's not just journaling to kind of record your thoughts, it's journaling to help you emotionally progress out of whatever situations are causing you stress, anxiety, or things you would prefer to just have out of your psyche or your heart. It's journaling with the purpose, understanding what events are triggering the negative emotions that you'd like to get rid of, and whether or not those things are actually true. Look at this in that respect. More and more as we move forward, I'm not sure we can afford to be consumers of news as much as we probably do well to go out and aggressively seek out information, and not just at random. As people of God, if we understand that things are developing along these lines of biblical prophecy, maybe it's good to have what they call containers of information. And as you run across news stories, the more that you realize these are, say, 7 different areas or 4 different areas that the Bible said maybe pay attention to. You don't have to necessarily read the news stories at the time, but maybe flag them and just throw them in the bucket for later when you have some time. And over time, what you may be able to see are some trends as to whether or not these news stories are actually leading or leaning into a direction that the Bible has said is inevitably going to happen at some point anyway. And so that was really what this is more about. It is making sure that we try as much as we can to be less consumers of news that's delivered to us, and maybe go out and seek information as it's being, as it's happening worldwide. And that's one of the reasons why I pull news stories from India, I pull news reports from DW, Germany's network, from France, from all those different places. Because just like the biggest fire in the world we knew nothing about, that's the way that the Bible describes end times events creeping up on an otherwise unsuspecting population. So when Paul says be ready, he's saying make sure that as much as possible you set your nets up to catch information that other people are otherwise missing. And that's what this is about. It's not so much whether Marcus is trying to predict an end date, it's encouraging you to catch information in a different way, since I'm not sure it's being delivered to us from the perspective of biblical people or people who take biblical prophecy seriously. So with that, thanks for your patience. A couple of more interesting videos, but we're already past time, and I appreciate your time. With that, anybody want to close us out in prayer if there are no questions? Well, appreciate it.